The spookiest month of the year is at hand, and to get into the spirit, I thought it would be fun to look at an icon of modern horror, the great Junji Ito, and explain how you can bring some of his horrifying sensibilities to your next Pathfinder 1E adventure. I'll break down the monsters, the mechanics, and the madness you can unleash on your players to send them spiraling down into a world of horror that will make them shiver, or smash them completely into greasy stains in a back alley. Or, turn them into dolls or snails or whatever. But before we get into it, if you are interested in taking your game further, check out the D6Damage Discord. We have great discussions about all aspects of the game, character builds, strategy guides, and much, much more. You'll find a link to our Discord in the description of this video. Alright then, now let's get into the terrifying world of Junji Ito. Now, Junji, like several other very talented horror writers, has an emotional core to his work, a through line that represents the emotional state that he's very, very good at reaching. Other writers with this ability are guys like Edgar Allan Poe. The emotional core of his work was suspense. You could see great examples in The Telltale Heart, The Pit and the Pendulum, and of course The Raven. Another noteworthy example is H.P. Lovecraft, whose core was fear of the unknown. This is exemplified with Call of Cthulhu, The Dunwich Horror, and At the Mountains of Madness. Now, for Junji, his emotional core is disgust. This is very clear in Greased, Slug Girl, and Mold. Now, when you sit down to plan your next Pathfinder 1E horror-themed adventure, there are three main avenues where you can bring Junji's disgusting flavor to your game. First, the monsters. The various tales of terror from this master of horror have quite a few memorable monsters. You also have player effects. An often seen element of Junji's work is body horror, and Pathfinder has plenty of options for that. Finally, there's the environment. As often as not, the source of supernatural evil is not a who, but a where in the stories of Junji Ito. So, first up, the monsters. Like any game of Pathfinder, you have a ton of leverage with the monsters you populate an area with, and how that affects the atmosphere of your world building. There are several different major creature types represented in Junji's works. First, outsiders. Lots of Ito's characters could be categorized as outsiders. Characters like the Crossroads Boy, the Ice Cream Man, or maybe the Bus, the Circus Ringleader, the godlike Hellstar, and Junji's most popular character, Tomi. Now, all of these characters have something in common, at least from the perspective of a Pathfinder dungeon master. They all have a very distinct and noticeable effect on the humans around them, affecting their minds and bodies in disturbing ways. As an example, despite her grotesque true form, Tomi has a lot in common with a succubus, and the obsessive or murderous actions of humans that she's charmed would fit well with any succubus. Another category is undead. The creatures that you could categorize as undead don't turn up that often, but there are a few of them in Junji's works, like the alleyway ghosts, the hare in the attic, or the whispering woman. These are almost always vengeful spirits after someone for doing something. I've talked about the ghost template before, and it's a good go-to. Just remember, skeletal, decayed, bloated, or horrible in some way is what you're looking for, instead of a ghost that looks basically like the person did when they were alive. Unless, of course, you like the lingering farewell, in which case, you're probably running a different kind of game. A really good option for grotesque undead in Pathfinder is the Penanggalan template. This is great for coming up with grotesque vampires that are flying heads with organs trailing behind them. Next category, aberrations. This is much more H.P. Lovecraft's thing, but Ito does bring us a few aberrations, like the thing that drifted ashore or the stench of death. Both have parasitism as a theme. The stench uses living creatures and weird robot legs, and the thing that drifted ashore turns humans that it's eaten into parasites. A fun encounter could be a dead aboleth washed up on shore, with its spawn acting like the parasite humans. The final monster subtype we're going to look at are monstrous humanoids, and this is where Junji's best work is found. Fuchi, the neighbor lady, the snails, and Azumi from Uzumaki would all fit well here. Now in Pathfinder 1E, Flesh Warped and Sin Spawn give you all the body horror that you could want. Reading the descriptions of these things and their abilities is an exercise in grossness. Also, in the particular case of Fuchi and the neighbor lady, you could do something with hags. Just imagine having an anise hag as a model for some poor NPC painter. Now, let's move on to the effects on the players. The macabre tales of Junji Ito are full of madness and transformations, both of which can be applied to your players. Let's start by looking at effects on the body. Stories like Shiver, Slug Girl, Uzumaki, and of course the Enigma of Amagiri Fault have great examples of characters being changed in horrible ways. One good option you have are horrific diseases, and these are horrific. They get progressively worse as a creature continues to suffer from the disease, finally ending in a grisly death. You have things like brain moss. This is a fungus that consumes the brain, making its victim increasingly lethargic and susceptible to suggestions, before finally growing out of the ears and nose. There are also gore worms. These are parasitic worms that burrow out of the host and spray their eggs into the air. Finally, there's skin wasting. The victim is slowly petrified as their skin, muscles, and organs are transformed into bone from the outside in. Next, a similar but distinctly magical malady are curses, and you have many magical options for making your players suffer. Some pre-made curses are famine. Any food the victim tries to eat instantly rots. Ravenous or parched. The victim suffers from constant hunger or thirst. Unlucky. A victim must roll twice and take the worst results. This could be caused by having all of their guardian spirits eaten. The last example I'll give you is mummy rot. This is both a curse and a disease. It causes 1d6 con damage and 1d6 charisma damage. This would be a great condition to represent the holes from Shiver. The final category of physical changes I'd like to look at are grafts and flesh crafting. I went over a number of these items in my body horror video, so if you want to check that out, there is a link in the description of this video. Forcibly giving a graft to a player would be very horrifying. Some of your options are antenna. The victim's eyes are replaced with antennae growing from their eye sockets. Grasping tendril. A tendril replaces an arm or gets grafted onto the chest, giving the creature a secondary natural attack. Now, how much control the lucky recipient has over this appendage is up to you. Finally, there's sallow flesh. The victim is covered with a layer of undead skin that gives them a +2 natural armor bonus and causes unintelligent undead to perceive the victim as undead, and probably looks really creepy. So with effects of the body out of the way, let's look at effects on the mind. Less overt and visual than the body horror effects, the mind can still change characters in very bizarre and unsettling ways, such as bizarre obsessions with things like spirals, or the constant fear of being watched. Let's look at a few examples. First, madness. Players can go crazy in a lot of different ways, with some interesting effects, like mania and phobia. The victim becomes obsessed with or terrified by something that will make them make a will save to become either fascinated or frightened. There's also psychosis. The player is driven to kill or plan to kill friends and enemies alike. The player could act this out on their own, or you as the DM could take control of that player when their psychosis manifests. Finally, schizophrenia. In high-stress situations, the victim must make a will save or become confused, resulting in either acting normally, not acting at all, attacking the nearest thing, or harming themselves. Next, even dreams aren't safe, with creatures like night hags on the prowl. A chaotic or evil creature can be the subject of a night hag dream attack. Unless there is an ethereal creature nearby able to confront and defeat the night hag, the victim of this attack will suffer 1 point of constitution drain, after what is, I'm sure, a long dream of being lost in a town without streets. Finally, let's talk about magical compulsion. The Gios spell is a great way to force players to complete some bizarre action. A nice feature of this spell is the fact that it lasts until the quest is completed. So it could last a whole campaign long if you want it to. So we've looked at the body and we've looked at the mind. Now let's talk about some transformations. This is for if you want to go all the way with the horror of being turned into something gross. You have a couple of options. First up, Baleful Polymorph. This is really meant for you upset a witch and get turned into a frog. But you could flavor it pretty easily into saying they get turned into a slug or a doll or something. Next, the Corruption System. I've covered the Corruption System in my body horror video, and it's tailor-made for just this kind of thing, particularly the Deep One and Hive corruptions, both of which feel right at home in the works of Junji Ito. Now, before we move on to the next section, I want to talk about an important way to use these player effects. Often in fantasy, a curse or malady is the result of violating some taboo, taking an artifact, or pissing off a supernatural something. There's a level of fairness or cause and effect to it. But in the world of horror, that's not necessarily the case. In fact, it makes it less terrifying if there's any kind of explanation or justification for it. It's scarier and it's worse if it just happens. Alright, the final category, Places of Terror. Another lesson a DM can take from the works of Junji Ito is, similar to how there doesn't need to be a cause for a curse, there doesn't need to be a villain behind events. The place itself can be the threat that your players need to tackle. And you have some great tools for this. Haunts and hazards. Haunts are similar to magical traps in they can replicate the effect of almost any spell. And they give the DM a lot of license to say what this manifestation looks like. The long hair in the attic could be an effect like black tentacles. The lighthouse in Uzumaki could fireball anyone walking up the stairs at sundown. Or the cliffside of Amagiri Fault might tell you via the command spell, "This is your hole. It was meant for you." Now, a lot goes into haunts. They can trigger once or be persistent. They're not visible until they manifest, unless you're using a spell like Detect Undead or Detect Alignment. And they're vulnerable to positive energy damage. So players do have ways to deal with them if they think ahead. Now, let's talk about hazards. You can get a lot of gross, creepy moments out of mundane hazards, like leeches, rot grubs, ravenous mold, or insect swarms. But if you really want a place to feel cursed, I would recommend looking at the Suicide Cop's Horrifying Hazard. It replicates the effect of the Terrible Remorse spell at caster level 10th, every 24 hours. And it covers the area of an entire forest. But you can reflavor not just the setting, but the spell that it replicates. It could be a tunnel that casts stone to mud on the floor and swallows hapless travelers, like the Mysterious Tunnel. It could cast flesh to stone, and you would get something like Toontown or Earthbound. There are all kinds of possibilities for this great horrifying hazard. Finally, you can combine hazards and haunts into one terrifying dungeon, full of unseen and unknowable forces waiting to murder your PCs in disgusting ways. Thank you very much for watching this D6Damage DM guide to Junji Ito. If you're interested in more strategy builds, gameplay guides, and other Pathfinder 1E content, check out our channel right here on YouTube. And if you're interested in game sourcebooks, dice, miniatures, and much, much more, check out Noble Knight Games. There's an affiliate link in the description of this video. Finally, if you'd like a good old-fashioned haunted house adventure, check out Sorceress, the Dietrich House, available right now on Drive to RPG.